All right, let's dive in. Today we're talking about something that's a pretty big deal for renters in California. We're talking 60-day notices to vacate.
Yeah, those two little words, 60 days. They can cause a lot of stress.
Absolutely. So we got a ton of information here. Basically, our mission is to break down what these notices actually mean and why they're so important for tenants to understand.
Definitely. It can be so confusing with all the legal terms and everything. Think of it like this. A 60-day notice is like a formal way for your landlord to say they're planning on ending your month-to-month rental agreement.
Okay, so it's not an eviction notice, but more like a heads up that you might have to move.
Exactly. And those 60 days are really important because it's the time you have, legally, to find a new place.
I see. So it's not like they can just snap their fingers and expect you to be out the next day. But I'm guessing there are specific reasons a landlord can give one of these notices, right? They can't just decide they don't like your choice of curtains, then give you a 60-day notice.
You're right. The landlord has to have what's called a just cause to end your tenancy, especially after the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 came into effect.
Just cause. So what does that actually mean? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Let's say they want to move a family member in.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Or they're selling the property to someone who's going to live there themselves. Those are valid reasons. Or maybe they need to do major renovations, something that means the place has to be empty. It's not just a matter of them wanting you out because, well, just because.
That makes sense. It's about protecting tenants from being kicked out unfairly. But we keep hearing about these exceptions to the 60-day rule. Can you tell us more about those?
Absolutely. There are definitely situations where a shorter notice might be legal. Like if you've only been living in the unit for less than a year.
Oh, interesting.
A 30-day notice might be enough then.
Gotcha.
And sometimes it depends on the building too. If the property is pretty new, like built within the last 15 years, there might be different rules.
Okay, so the length of your tenancy and even how old the building is can change things. Are there any other situations where those 60 days might not apply?
Here's one that might surprise you. If your landlord actually lives in the same property with you, like in a house or condo, they might only have to give you a 30-day notice.
Wow, even if you've been living there for years.
Even then, sometimes, it's a little different when you're sharing the space with your landlord.
That is surprising. I bet a lot of people don't realize that. So it really highlights how important it is to know your rights as a tenant. But what if you're in a situation where you need to move out before those 60 days are up? Is there any way to do that?
Well, it can be tricky. But the best thing you can do is talk to your landlord, explain your situation, and see if you can work something out. You never know, they might be understanding and agree to waive the full 60 days.
So good communication is key, like in most situations. But what happens if a tenant, let's say, they just disappear? No notice, nothing, just gone. What are the consequences of that?
That's when things can get messy, legally speaking. The landlord could sue you for the rent you would have paid for the rest of those 60 days.
Oof. That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, and it can really hurt your chances of finding a decent place to rent in the future. Landlords definitely check those things.
Yeah, it's like burning bridges, but with your housing options. So tenants have a responsibility to give proper notice.
What about the landlords, though?
What happens if they don't follow the rules?
Well, if they try to evict someone without giving the right notice, they can get in big trouble. Courts take those notice periods very seriously. It's about fairness and protecting everyone's rights.
That's good to know. It sounds like it's a system that's designed to protect both sides, tenants and landlords. Now, we've talked about the notice periods and all that, but what about this relocation assistance thing I keep hearing about? What is that exactly?
It's basically a payment that landlords might have to give to tenants in certain situations, but we'll dive into all the details of relocation assistance in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so let's dig into this whole relocation assistance thing. It sounds like it could be a big help for tenants who are being asked to move, even if it's for a legal reason.
Yeah, definitely. It's designed to help cover some of those costs that come with finding a new place.
Costs like what? Give us the rundown.
Well, think about things like moving expenses. Those can add up quickly.
Oh, for sure.
Application fees for new places.
Yeah.
Even the security deposit on a new rental.
It's like a domino effect. You're already having to move, and then all these extra expenses pile on.
Exactly. So relocation assistance is meant to give tenants a little bit of a cushion financially to help them get back on their feet.
I can see how that would be a huge relief.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that it only applies when the landlord is ending the tenancy for a reason that's not the tenant's fault.
Right, like those just cause evictions we talked about earlier. So if a landlord is selling the property to someone who's going to live there, or they're moving a family member in, the tenant might be eligible for this assistance. But how much are we talking about here? Is there like a standard amount?
The typical amount is 1 month's rent.
Oh, okay.
But keep in mind that some cities and counties might have their own rules that require landlords to pay more than that.
Really?
Especially in places with strong tenant protection laws. So it's always a good idea to check your local laws to see what applies in your situation.
That's a good point. It's not just about state law. It's also about those local variations.
Right. Now, here's a question that comes up a lot. What about tenants who are behind on rent? Do they still qualify for relocation assistance if they get a 60-day notice?
Good question. I would imagine not, since they haven't been keeping up with their end of the agreement.
You're right. If a tenant is being evicted for not paying rent, that's usually considered an at-fault eviction. So in those cases, they wouldn't be entitled to relocation assistance.
It makes sense. There has to be some accountability there. It's a system that protects both sides, like we were saying earlier. But let's say a tenant gets a 60-day notice, and they think the landlord's reason for ending the tenancy isn't valid. Do they have any options? Can they fight back?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Tenants in California have rights.
That's good to hear.
If they think something's fishy, like maybe they've heard rumors about a big rent increase coming, or the landlord has a history of shady evictions, they should definitely talk to a legal expert.
So it's not just about accepting the notice. Without question, they can actually investigate and challenge it if they have reason to believe it's not legitimate.
Exactly, because those just cause evictions can sometimes be a bit subjective, you know? What the landlord considers a necessary renovation might not actually meet the legal requirements for ending a tenancy.
That's where having some legal guidance can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And speaking of legal guidance, I know you have some insights into the specific challenges that come with 60-day notices here in Southern California. What can you tell us about those regional differences in the law?
Well, it's true that California is known for having strong tenant protections. But things can get even more complicated when you factor in all the local ordinances.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like some cities have rent control measures that directly impact how those 60-day notices can be used.
Right. So you have to know the rules, not just at the state level, but at the city or county level, too.
Wow, it's a lot to keep track of. What might be a perfectly valid just cause eviction in one city could be completely different somewhere else.
Absolutely. So it's crucial for both landlords and tenants to understand those local nuances. Otherwise, they could run into some serious legal problems.
It sounds like it's easy to get lost in all those details.
It definitely can be. And that's why it's so important to get professional help if you're ever unsure about something.
Good advice.
Here in Southern California, we see all kinds of situations. You know, sometimes landlords try to find loopholes to get around rent control.
I can imagine.
And sometimes tenants are facing eviction for reasons that just don't seem right.
It's not just about the law. It's about people's homes and their lives.
Exactly. So when you're dealing with something as serious as a 60-day notice, having someone on your side who understands the law and can fight for you can make all the difference.
We've covered so much about 60-day notices. It's clearly a complex topic.
Absolutely.
But, before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we talked about earlier, that whole idea of seeking legal counsel.
Right.
Why is it so important for tenants to have an attorney, especially when dealing with something like a 60-day notice?
It's about having someone who can really fight for you, someone who knows the ins and outs of the law, especially here in California where things can get pretty complicated.
Right, because we've talked about all those nuances.
Yeah.
With state laws and local ordinances.
Exactly. An attorney can help you figure out what applies to your specific situation, and they can make sure your rights are being protected every step of the way.
So it's not just about having someone to translate legal jargon. It's about having a real advocate on your side.
Exactly. They can review any notices you get from your landlord. They might even be able to negotiate with the landlord on your behalf.
Wow.
And if things go to court, they'll be there to represent you and make sure your voice is heard.
That's huge. It really levels the playing field.
It does. Landlords often have their own attorneys, so it's only fair that tenants have someone in their corner, too.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are dealing with a 60-day notice, or maybe even just have some questions about their rights as tenants, what's the best way for them to find a good attorney?
Look for someone who specializes in tenant rights.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
They'll have the experience and the knowledge to handle these kinds of cases effectively. And if you're here in Southern California, in Orange County, Los Angeles, Riverside, or San Diego, you can always check out martinezlawcenter.com for expert legal help.
Perfect, because sometimes you need someone who's been there, who's fought these battles before, to guide you through it.
You got it. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about your rights as a tenant, the better you'll be able to protect yourself.
So well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully our listeners now have a much better understanding of 60-day notices in California. And they know they don't have to face this alone. There's help out there.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.